Well, it's good to be together again to talk about preparation for outreach. And in this session, I want to get just a bit practical with you in terms of the reporting process that we would expect of you from the outreaches, number one. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the travel in Africa, which is also going to be an important process for all of you to take note of. Although all of you may not be the drivers and the whatever of the vehicles, it is good for you to understand some of those aspects. But let me start just this morning by talking a little bit about the reporting process. What are you going to do when you get on outreach to let the people out there know what is happening in the area where you are working? Now, some of you may think that there's a ferry that travels around and writes these things and hands them out, but it really isn't like that. And so the first thing I want to say to you that we will expect of you is for each one of you to write a daily journal. And for that purpose, you need to get yourself a couple of hardbound books or something that won't mess up very easily. And don't get a fancy thing that's going to cost you a lot of money. I don't think that's necessary. But just some form of a book where you could maybe use a page per day. Some days it may be less, some days it may be more. And in that journal that you will just write your experience. It's been very interesting. The previous team that we had in Madagascar, as you sort of read through their journal, you can understand so much of what actually happened on the ground, in the hearts of people, in their experience. So that's going to be really important that you would write that journal. And for you to also understand that at the end of the outreach, we would like to have those journals. So we'd have to do one of two things. Either you must write it twice, which may be not a clever idea, or you need to come back and we need to photocopy it. And so we'll work on that. But for those of us maybe in other parts of the world where you don't maybe have photocopy facilities or something like that, you may just want to write your journal twice so that one of those can go to the school afterwards. And you say, well, what do you want to do with that? We're not going to flash them around and give them to everybody, but it will give leadership a good understanding of what you, as I said, what you've experienced in the field. And it will be good for us in the future as we train other people to understand how we can actually work on bettering our whole training process. So there is the daily journal, number one, and from that, I believe, a lot of material can be derived that you would be able to write some reports on. Now, every team, and I would like the team leaders to take note of this, every team must have a person that will be like a scribe, that will be like the official report writer. And so you have to find out as you meet in your teams who is the person best suited for that situation. And then obviously, as you are in your teams there, that you would help one another in terms of that, so that it's not just one person's perspective, but a couple of people's perspective as well. And then you will be writing some reports of some sort. Now, in some cases, your communication back to headquarters, if I can call it that, back in this case to the World Mission Center, your communication back here may be through fax, and that is maybe the minority of you, where you will have fax capacity. A few of you through the two-way radio system may be able to email, and that may not be possible with many of you, although in some cases, especially the leaders that are traveling in across the whole region, you would be able to get to an internet cafe or something, and you would be able to email this kind of a situation. But you need to factor into your time a time frame where you will be writing reports, maybe special events that you've got to take note of. Now, I want you to begin to think that way. It's really important. Think about special events. Think about things that happen that may be of real interest to people that would read it. Now, let me tell you, most people don't want to hear, we went out, we preached the gospel, 70 people came to Jesus, da-da-da-da-da, and you give all of these statistics. Most people don't want to hear that. Although they're important and we want them from a driving the process sort of perspective. But what people really want to hear is those little special stories that happen. The story of Samson was written by one of the previous team members that just almost from a different perspective looked at how Samson came to Jesus in one of these unreached people groups, and what the amazing experience was of that person. And it's become a story that's gone all over the world. And you know, it came back and it was maybe just a bit edited, but at the end of the day, it had to do with the people in that unreached people group, and sort of a story situation was written about that. The first time I read the story of Samson, I just wept. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Just to have seen it from that person's perspective. So you need to think that way. Now sometimes, and some of you are analytical and you want all the facts, praise God, we want that. But in other cases, we just want some of those stories to come through. Now, as I said, in some cases you can fax or email it. In other cases you can't do that. In other cases you'll have to wait until one of the leader representatives come past you, and that they will then pick up those things and bring them through to us back in South Africa through whatever system we would work on that. So if you could think through that, that would be important in your reporting thing. And then the other thing that you need to do is get to write short, almost notes. Don't write 12-page letters, but I am sure your family, your friends, your church back home would all like to hear how is it going with Julie in the middle of the desert. And it will be good for you just to write short little notes like that, which again, the people can come around, some of our area coordinators can come around, pick that up, and we will ultimately get it out to your folks so that there is a communication structure happening in there. Now, we can only do as much as you do. You're going to have time on your hands when you are on outreach. And so I want to ask you, please don't write books. If we get major pages of writing and whatever, we probably will discard it. So we almost want bulletin stuff. And don't be scared to say, Mom and Dad, it's great. We're out here. This is what's happening. And by the way, I really love you and whatever. Even if somebody here is going to type it, I think just kind of communicate as you would normally do so that we can at least get some form of letter out there. And once you start getting into the orientation phase, and I'll talk about that in the next session, but once you get there, then you will understand how the area coordinators will come around and how they will actually pick up from you all those letters, the reports. Then the other thing in terms of reporting, we do want to have at least one camera. In actual fact, preferably only one camera in every one of these groups, of these outreach teams. And what we will do is we will actually supply you with the film. And the object of those photographs is really to report back what's happening in the field. So don't give the camera to somebody that just gets trigger happy. We want to get very specific sort of photographs. And then, quite honestly, there may be times that you do want to take a photograph of with a chief or something like that, or with whoever you're working with there. That'll be fine, and we'll talk about that again with the leaders later, so that we keep a balance there so that you do have photographs from there. But I just think that we need at least a camera in every one of the teams. And team leaders, you need to take note of that. And then the other thing you need to take note of is that we do want to know who that professional, quote-unquote, photographer is going to be for us in that people group. And let me just say, anybody that takes the photographs must be responsible to write a little caption about every photograph that's been taken. So that means if you know you've taken photograph number 1, then you write there, well, this is the picture of whoever and this, that, and the other, so that when the photographs come or the film comes back to us, that we actually know what's happening. Otherwise, we'll just get pictures, we wouldn't know what it means. And again, our area coordinators will travel, when they do travel around, they will pick up the reports and the film, and with the film will be this description, so that when we do get the film developed here back in South Africa, that we will then know what the film was all about. Now, once you get back from the field, we will then let you have a look at the photographs. And those that you then would like, you can then order and have the photographs of your choice And obviously you'll pay for the duplication of those photographs in that situation. So just gives us all a chance and all an opportunity to be able to write to our people, to be able to give input into the report process of what's happening with us, and on the other hand, to be able to get a hold of some of the pictures that we may never get our hands on if we didn't have some kind of a system like that. So we do foresee that at the end of the outreach, we will put all these photographs per team on a table or something, and you'd be able to, as a team, go through there and maybe number them or something, and then you'd be able to, from there, order them. We'll have them made, and you can just cover those costs, and then we'll get those photographs to you. And I think that really will help us. But the issue of reporting is going to be very, very important. And you say, important for what? Well, I believe it's going to be extremely important for the future of the church plant in that area. Because beyond your involvement in that area, and maybe, by the way, some of you may feel called to that area afterwards. But apart from that, that may happen, and that we will then talk about how can we facilitate that. Apart from that, we do want to think that in the future we can get more people involved in that area until that church is established and until it's growing, until eventually it's an indigenous church that we can take our hands off. And for that purpose, we need to get as much reporting out there to as many people as possible, and I'm sure the Lord will lay it on some people's hearts to say, I'd like to get involved in that situation. And that's going to depend on your reporting process. So you become almost an ambassador for that unreached people group whilst you're working there. And you need to keep that in mind, because the church in that people group will depend on, can we get more people there? Can we involve the national church? And in all probability, can we raise the financial resource base to keep that church plant going until it's on its own? And there's no ways that a few of us can go to all of these unreached people groups now and go and write their story, when in actual fact you're on the ground and you can write the story when you are there. So it's a very important thing, and we are going to be very hard on those of you that don't do that process. So that's the one thing in terms of the reporting process. The second thing I'd like to talk about this morning is just the whole issue of travel in Africa. So I'm going to switch lanes on you now and talk about something else. And just want to give you a couple of real, almost practical tips that will help you. And I need you to make notes, because this is going to either have you travel easily in Africa, or it's going to have you have all kinds of problems in the African context. And let me tell you, there are all kinds of lurking problems in the African context, by the way. The first thing I'd like to say is, before you even leave, you will be expected at some point to pack out all of your clothes and your belongings and your whatever, and our Sergeant Major Doris is going to come and check that you have everything that you need in that process, so that we are sure that you're not leaving here with half your stuff behind. And that is a real serious thing, because when you get 500 kilometers from the nearest town, and now you say, well, I forgot something behind, then we're in all kinds of trouble. And we're not about to come back and fetch it, so we're going to have to make sure that everybody has what they need. But then, once that has happened, you need to list everything that you have. Just a list of where you are with a little description next to it. Khaki pants, black skirt, whatever the case may be. That's the one thing. The other thing is that you need to list anything electronic, and you have to add onto that its serial number. And anything electronic with its serial number, the name, the whatever, let's say for argument's sake you've got a shaver, and you say, well, it's a Philips shaver, this is the serial number, and you need to put like a value next to it in rand or in US dollars or something, so that you have that. And any of those things on a list has to be on a separate list. So you've got your personal effects without your electronic stuff, and then you have your list of electronic stuff with all of its serial numbers, and you will need those to clear the border. Otherwise, one day you go in there with your electronic stuff, and when you turn it around and you want to bring it out, and they say, where did you get the stuff from? And then you've got all kinds of problems and all kinds of drama. And the driver of the vehicle will have your list. So you're going to make a whole bunch of those lists, copies of them. Don't just go with one, because every border post probably will keep one of those things. And my suggestion actually is to the leaders that when you have all those lists, get somebody to compile your vehicle or your group's stuff on one single list. You can put them under, headings, Paulina stuff, Henny stuff, Sudumo stuff, but then at least you've got all of that so that when you clear customs that you can actually get a stamp on that situation. Now that only pertains to electronic stuff. Some of the teams may have some electronic equipment with you. That needs to go on that list as well. As an example, in some of the vehicles there are two-way radios. You better make sure that the two-way radio is on the list. Some of the cars have radio players. Make sure that the serial numbers of those radios in the cars is on that list. So that's an important thing. The other thing that's going to be very important is, and this is maybe for the drivers and the team leaders to know, that before you leave the country, you need a certified copy of the papers of the car, the registration papers of the car, and you need certified copies. This will be certified at the South African police station. You'll have certified letter from the owner of the vehicle that says you have permission to drive this vehicle, and then you've got to mention the countries. Now, some of you, it's just across into Botswana, but for somebody like Henny that drives all the way up into Tanzania and from there up into Uganda and Rwanda and whatever, you better make sure you have all of those permissions on that note. Now, that is for you to ask those letters and those copies of the registration documents, and all of that together with this list of electronic stuff now goes into a file, and you keep that with you. And I would suggest that you don't just have one of those. I would suggest that you have 2 or 3 of them, and that you put them into different places. Maybe even give one to somebody else in his luggage and just leave it in there, so that if ever you lost that thing, then you would not be in a ditch that you can't get it. Once you get out of what is called the SADC countries, I'm not going to explain that this morning, but once you get out of those countries, then you have to export the vehicle. Then it's not just a crossing over the border. And when you export the vehicle, they will give you an export document. And if you lose that export document, you will not bring that vehicle back into the country again. And so that's one of those documents that don't lose. And when you get to some part of Africa where you can make a photocopy of it, then photocopy 2 or 3 of them and put them into these files. And don't take lightly what I've just said to you. And all of you as a team, make sure that you remember that. By the way, if you do tow a trailer, what I've said about the cars is true about the trailers as well. That you need the same registration paper, copies, certified, as well as the permission to be able to use those trailers within that given situation. When you make these copies of these documents, it is important that your area leader has a file with copies of your documents with him or her. So that if something does happen, that we don't have to all the way from here now drive up to Rwanda to try and bail you out in Rwanda, but that the area leader in that area will actually have a copy of that with him. Just a bit of depth in our logistics, otherwise we can find ourselves in all kinds of difficulties. Now, a golden rule, would you all write this down? This is important. It's a very simple thing, but write it down. A golden rule is you do not travel at night in Africa. If you want to be fired, disqualified, I don't know what else I can say, then try and do that. I don't want that to happen. So you've always, in your planning in terms of travel, you've always got to think, will I make the next town in time? And if I don't, then I stay here. But we do not travel at night. There is just too much of a risk, especially in the area of animals and donkeys and wild animals and whatever. And let me tell you, those things are dangerous. I don't care who says what. You see a little impala standing on the side of the road, and he's just a little impala. Let me tell you, that thing is really dangerous. A few years ago, I was traveling with a friend of mine, and we were driving in a Mercedes-Benz, and it was broad daylight, by the way. It was 10:30 in the morning. We were driving in Zimbabwe, and we were doing 80 kilometers an hour. It was a diesel vehicle. We were going up a hill. It was just as slow as it could be. And the next moment, one of these Impalas jumped in front of the car, came right through the window. My whole face was cut open here. And this has been fixed up with plastic surgery. But my whole face was cut open here. My whole face was blue. And the buck actually came in and landed on the back seat of the car. Now, let me tell you, we couldn't understand that. You sit in a car next time and look what the distance is between you and the guy next to you. And you'll find that a buck even this big can't fit through there. But what had happened, we only figured out much later, is that in the time that the buck came through the window, it turned. Because it was jumping from left to right, but it was lying with its horns on the other side of the back seat. And it almost, we just had to say this afterwards, it was like the Lord just helped us, and that buck turned, it flipped like that between us. Now, if it hadn't done that, we would have been in much bigger trouble than what we could dream about. And you don't want to get into those things. So all I'm saying to you is, don't travel at night. It is a golden rule, and we don't want to breach that at all. If you're in public transport like a bus or whatever, that's a different story. But if you are in a private vehicle, stay off the roads at night. And then the other thing is that our speed limit, apart from where the speed limits are stated, 80 kilometers an hour, 60 kilometers an hour, or whatever, our speed limit will not exceed 120. So whoever of you driving, know your distances and know that you may be going to drive slower than that, but that's important. And I want to tell you, I've driven in Africa thousands upon thousands of kilometers, and eventually you feel like this is hard to do 120 on this road. Because it's just straight. I mean, you drive through Botswana, and it is just hundreds of kilometers straight. And you feel like, well, what now? But don't start racing or going faster. Make sure that you pre-plan your whole process. And drivers, don't be offended when your people tell you you're going too fast. Will everybody hear that this morning? So that we just take note of that. Very important. And then of necessity, everybody that drives, all of you driving vehicles, make sure that you have an international driver's license. And your international driver's license you can get by going to the AA in town with 2 photographs and a couple of rand, and with your normal driver's license, and they will then issue you an international driver's license. So you don't have to go and write a test and whatever. They will give you one because you have a driver's license. But don't leave here without the international driver's license, and don't leave here without your normal driver's license. That's really important, because you will run into roadblocks in Africa. And they will ask you for your license documentation. And so make sure you have it. Make sure it's available. Don't say, it's at the back in the bottom of... Don't do that. Make sure your stuff is in the cubbyhole or whatever, that you can lay your hands on it so that you can get through those roadblocks faster than normal. Now, when we get to the border post, and remember, every time you clear a border, there are 2 border posts. You leave South Africa, so you go out of South Africa, border post, and you go into Botswana, so you're checking another border post. There's normally only about 2-3 kilometers between the 2 of them. But just remember, whenever you get to those border posts, a few things that will help you. The one is, when you go to the building, don't mess around. Everybody say that. Don't mess around. Don't be loud, okay? Don't start shouting and this and that. I'm telling you, you could stay there for 3 to 4 hours. If you went with me and you did that, I'd kick you where you didn't want to be done, because you could cause me to sit there for a long time. It's really important. And the more you travel, the more easy you'd feel like, well, I can make a bit of a joke. And if you do, you're in all kinds of trouble if you have somebody on that border that is not friendly. Now, some guys like you to be friendly and whatever, and I'm not saying don't be friendly, but don't make a noise. When you get to the building, unlike anybody else that may stand all over the place, when you get to the building, you stand in a straight stripe. In other words, a straight line. Don't start just all bundling onto the thing, because 90% of the border posts in Africa, you will be reprimanded and you will be told to get in a line. And then in all probability, they will start dealing with all other people around you, and you will just stand there and you will just wait an hour or half an hour or even 2 hours. So how you actually cross the border is really important. Lest you stand there for a long time, you don't want to do that. And it's really just a couple of very, very plain things. Stand in a straight line, be quiet, be courteous. When you get to the people, be courteous, good morning, sir, and answer their questions that they're asking. I think that's really important. If they say, do you have anything to declare? No, you don't. You have nothing to declare. You shouldn't have anything to declare except your personal effects and your driver, who is the leader. When you cross a border post, the driver is the leader. Otherwise, you've got two people telling you what to do, and the driver has to get you through the border post. And so just make sure of that. Make sure you all have a pen with you. In actual fact, make sure you all have 2 pens with you, cheap ones. And make sure that they're not stuck somewhere that you've lost or whatever, because what happens at the border post, you normally get there, and the driver will go into the border post. I would normally do this. I tell my people, just wait outside here. I would go inside. I would ask them, which forms do I fill in? They give me the arrival forms or the departure forms. I go out, I give it to my guys. I say, fill it in. They got their passports and whatever else, and then they begin to fill them in, and then we go through that process on the inside when we filled in all our forms. One of the biggest mistakes teams make is to go inside these people's room, whether it's a mess or not, to go inside there and everybody is hanging over all the desks and tables and everybody is now filling in their forms. And the guy on the other side gets agitated and you've got problems. You don't want that. I'm sketching you the worst case scenario this morning. There are some places where you could probably do that and get away with it. But I don't even want to think that you'll try that, lest you hang in there for a couple of hours or even longer. So that's important. Now, when you get to a roadblock, key number 1 is be quiet. I've had this before. It's a crisis. I'm sitting behind the steering wheel. I've got this guy standing outside here, and he's agitated or whatever. Somebody else has made him cross. He's asking me a whole bunch of questions, and people in the back of my car making a racket. And I'm telling you what, I'm off the road, just like that. And he says, would you pull off? And the next moment, there I'm standing, and it's all kinds of unpack your stuff and take this out and do this, just because 1 or 2 people made a racket. Now, I want to say to the leaders here and the drivers, if that continues to happen, then let me know or let somebody in the structure know, and we will pull that person back out of the team, because it becomes a real danger to the team. And so we will not even think of handling that. But when you get into a roadblock, you stop. When you see a roadblock and you drive up to that, slow down big time. Don't think about driving up there and screeching your brakes. Just slow down and drive to that block as slowly as you possibly can, and the guys will appreciate that. And then he'll stop and he'll ask you some questions, and normally they will let you go. Where you come from? Come from Pretoria. Where you going to? I'm on my way to whatever. And you just answer the guy's questions, and then he may say, can I see your license, your this, your that, your papers? And all of that is going to be important that you just be able to answer him. Now, one of the issues that I haven't mentioned is as you come through that border post, very important, is that the driver must make sure that you buy a third-party disc at the border post. If you don't do that, I can guarantee you within 2 kilometers you'll be in a roadblock, and when you are in that roadblock within 2 kilometers, one of the first things you'll say is, can I see your insurance papers? And you're in all kinds of interesting processes. So make sure that you have your third-party insurance. Maybe I should go to that quickly for a moment, and then I'll come back to the roadblock thing. Is when you get to the border post, you go through immigration. Everyone goes through immigration. get your passport stamped. And then there is on the counter, if the drivers now would listen to me, there's on the counter an entry or exit book where you fill in the car's registration numbers and all of that stuff. And then once you've done that, you go to customs. The driver normally goes alone to customs. Now in some cases they may say, no, I want everybody here. You'll have your piece of paper with your electronic equipment, the numbers and whatever. The driver goes there and he stamps the customs document or gets it stamped and whatever, and he clears the car, whether you import it or just clear it, and you say, this is the car I'm driving. And then once you have done that, the next step is to say, where do I buy a third party? Now, this has happened to me before, where I say to the guy, sir, where do I buy a third party? And he says, sorry, the third party office is closed. And I'm like, I'm going nowhere without this third party. And the guys eventually are saying, well, we don't have a third party or whatever. Then what you need to do is you need that guy to write for you on your documentation the story that there is no third party available and that he is to tell you where to go to get that third party. And then you got to understand you are driving major risk because you have no third party insurance in that country, which if they catch you, could mean jail. But at least if you have this guy's writing and his stamp and whatever on there, then you drive to the nearest town. It's actually happened to us. We've had to spend 3-4 hours in the next town waiting for the third party office to open so that we can get a third party insurance. But you've got to make sure that you have a third party. Now, the absolute preference is you get your third party at the border, you keep it with you. Now, most third parties are valid for a year. So if you take note, if you've driven up through Zimbabwe and you're going to come back through Zimbabwe, just keep your third-party documentation because when you come back, you don't have to rebuy it. So that's going to be really important in terms of that. Now, just to get back to the roadblock thing, I was saying everybody needs to be quiet. You need to answer this guy's questions and whatever. And you need to try and be as courteous as you possibly can. Africa is full of roadblocks. Sometimes there are few. I have driven up through Botswana, which is a day's drive, and I have been stopped in 19 roadblocks. And now that doesn't happen often, but just for you to know, when you cross the border, you switch your brain. I've driven through there where they've put tables on the side of the road. And they literally would tell you, okay, sir, stop here. Would you please unpack your car? And then they would open every suitcase and they would mess up everything inside the suitcase. I'm telling you the worst case scenario. But they would mess up everything inside the suitcase and then leave it and you got to close it. Don't get cross with the guy. Don't you dare get cross with him. Just say, thank you, sir. Close your suitcase and love him. That's really important that you do that. And by the way, drivers, if you listen to me, there are places that in the minds of some of the African countries are high security places. When you get to a border, you never take a picture. If somebody catches you with a camera in your hand, you probably will lose the camera. And if I was your team leader, I would lose your head. No photographs at border posts. When you're at a roadblock, no photographs at a roadblock. That would be a disaster. And then in some cases, when you get to bridges and stuff like that, I know through Mozambique, there's a couple of major bridges there. You don't take out a camera on that bridge. Some people will say, stop, let's take a photo of the river. There are no ways we're stopping anywhere. We just keep going. No cameras out here. Because some people feel like that's high security. I know in Zambia, there's a bridge like that. It is as smooth as you can get because it's steel. The bottom is steel. I drove over there one day. I came down, and there was a board that said, keep left. Now, how many of you know when the board says keep left, you keep left? And the guy had a bad night, I'm sure. But I kept left, and when I stopped there, he was all over me. He said, why did you stop here? I said, well, there's a stop sign, and it said keep left. He said, keep left means off the road. So I was in all kinds of trouble because I wasn't off the road now. And the guy was shouting at me, and he was really upset and whatever else. And I thought, well, let me just back off and let me just be friendly with this guy. And then when that was done now, I was driving a fairly strong car, and I just put the car into drive, and I took my foot off the brake. I did not accelerate. And I just drove across the bridge, and the car was running faster than 5 kilometers an hour. Okay? And the sign said 5 kilometers an hour. There was no gasometer, there was no radar, nothing could catch me in terms of how fast, but according to this guy, I was driving too fast. When I got to the other side, it was chaos. He stopped me on the other side, he pulled me out of the car, I had an AK-47 in my back, and he said, now you walk up front there, and he marched me up to the sign, and he said, what's that? And I said, 5 kilometers an hour. He says, you will stay here 24 hours. And so there I sat. I wasn't allowed in the car. I was about 200 meters away from the car, and the people that I was traveling with me, including Dr. Phil Stein, by the way, they were traveling with me, they weren't allowed out the car. So I was not allowed in the car, they weren't allowed out the car, and we were going to stay there overnight. And anyways, it took a lot of real diplomacy. Not from me, because I was now not even close for the diplomacy. It really was Dr. Stein that got us out of it, because he just kind of started chatting after about 4 hours. Now, you must know, you've just wasted 4 hours, because I hadn't thought that this guy's really serious about his 5 kilometers an hour. Let me tell you, they're serious about that. So be careful. By the way, there is no logic when you travel in Africa. We were traveling once through a town in one of these countries, I won't mention the name, traveling through one of these countries, and the next moment we got caught in a speed trap. I didn't think they had a speed trap, but they actually had a radar. And so they caught us in this thing, and it was hundreds of thousands of their currency that we had to pay. And so we said, that's fine. But we were two combis. I mean, there was a combi behind me and this combi in front of me. And the combi behind me, suddenly, he also got a fine. I said, no ways. I mean, you caught me. I can understand that I have to pay. But how can you catch this guy? And they said, he's caught. I mean, we went to try and get that thing squashed. Eventually, we just had to go, and we just had to say, well, let's just pay for it before we could leave. So just make sure when you see signs, road signs, whatever, they're really important. And then the guys, those of you that are going to be driving, make sure, very simple stuff like, does your reverse lights work? Now, in a normal situation, that's not an issue. If you come through a place like Mozambique, your reverse lights had better work. Apart from that, your triangles. I came through there one day, and this guy could hardly speak English. My situation, I should have been able to speak Portuguese, but he said to me, "Triangles." I said, what? He said, "Triangles." And after about 10 minutes, I figured out this guy was wanting my triangles. You know, the red triangles of the car. Now, you better make sure you have those triangles in your cars, and you better make sure you never lose them. But when you drive through a country like Mozambique, and I need you to find those things out from wherever you're going to be driving through. In Mozambique, you put a blue and a yellow triangle on the back of your vehicle. Otherwise, you won't travel in Mozambique. To my knowledge, that's the only country like that. I have one on the back of the trailer. You can see it back at the base there. But you're going to have to just make sure that you have all of those things in place. So when you're crossing borders, when you get into roadblocks, of which there are many, you have to be sure that you're courteous, and you have to be sure that you've tried to abide in terms of the law. And then even if that happens, and praise God, it doesn't happen much in Africa anymore, but there are places that it does, the guys will stop you and they will do everything to get a bribe out of you. And we don't do that. Now, we don't go in there and say, "Yay, I'm not going to give you a bribe." We just stay courteous, but we just don't do that. If it means I stay there for 2 hours, then I stay there for 2 hours. I've had guys say to me at the border post when they get my passport, they say, "There's a page missing." And I'm like, "There's what?" He says, "There's a page missing." And then eventually I got my passport and I said, "But it's numbered, 1, 2, whatever." And he says, "There's a page missing." And then somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, he wants to know where's the $20 or the $50 bill. And I'm like, "You don't get no page there." And that's the time where you must, please don't get cheeky with the guys. That's not worth it. But rather just get into a situation of chatting to him and just telling him, listen, I'm a born-again Christian. I love Jesus. There's no ways that I'm paying no bribes. I don't believe that's right. And you don't have to get super spiritual in saying that either. But it is good for you just to be able to mention that to the guys. Let me quickly say 2 or 3 other things. Sometimes when you cross through a border, the officials will ask you whether you can take some people with you. And the policy of the mission center is plain. You don't pick up hitchhikers. So your answer is easy. You just say, I'm not allowed to do that. Apart from the fact that your car probably will be packed to capacity, the issue is plain. You don't pick up people in a situation like that. So that's important. And then I've already said something about the speed limit situation. Last thing I want to share with you just quickly about the vehicles. The vehicles is a major investment, and you need to understand that. And we are accountable to people that have made it possible for us to have these vehicles, and we are accountable to the Lord, I believe, in terms of stewardship for those vehicles. And so here's a couple of key things I want you to write, and I want to make sure that the drivers understand where we are. Number 1, we don't eat in the car. I'm not talking about having a sweet or something like that. That's fine. But you don't have ice creams in the car. You don't eat chocolates in the car, because the next thing is pieces of it break off, and in hot Africa they melt into the seats and whatever, and the car is a mess. When we have meals, you stop in the appropriate place and you actually eat outside the car, and then you get back in there. So you don't do that. The second thing is, even though you are on dust and dirty roads sometimes, you keep the car clean. It does not mean if you are working at the end of a 200-kilometer dust road that you never wash the car. I mean, I've seen that. And after 3 months, that car looks like a dog's breakfast. You know what I'm saying? And there's no ways. Even if you know, I'm going to travel again tomorrow and this thing is going to be full of dust, there's, I believe, a principle that we follow when we look after those vehicles inside and outside. And so we expect that of you, to be able to keep the vehicles clean. And then, obviously, when something breaks, it is really important that you tell the person in charge of the car, hey, I've just broken this handle off. Please don't just leave it, and then eventually it becomes a disunity situation. Because when the car comes back, you will be accountable for what's happened in the car. And Brother Cliff Green at the office will be the one that will check your car when it comes back. And so rather that you have a report of some sorts why something is broken, I believe that's important. Now, of course, the other thing is, don't offer your vehicle for transporting people. If you do that once, you're finished. Now, that almost sounds harsh because we'd like to cart people around. Let me tell you, I have had people in my vehicles that at the end of the day, I'm like, Lord, what am I even doing now? And I don't want you to do that. Because all you will do all day long is drive here, drive there, drive here, drive there. And by the time you come back, you would have spent so much money on fuel and whatever that no one would know how to deal with that. And 2 last points quickly is, the one is, those of you that are in charge of those vehicles, make sure that they go for their regular services, even if it's not in this country, that they go for their regular services. And each car has its own process in terms of services that you've got to look at. And just maybe I can say that some of these vehicles, under harsh conditions, needs to be serviced every 2,500 kilometers. Now, if you're on the open road, it's probably every 15,000 kilometers. If you're in the desert, it'll be every 2,500 kilometers. Really important that you take note of that. And then obviously, lastly, is make sure your vehicles are locked, that they are secure. All of the vehicles have gear locks on them. Never leave that vehicle without having put the gear lock on. I know it's a schlep to take it out and start up and this and that, but it really is important that you do those things. So just some of the practical things, I believe, when you do go on outreach. And I pray that that'll help you as you cross the borders into these various African countries. The Lord bless you.